What's with movement? Movement in games is the act of traversing an environment. It's how a player gets from point A to point B. Some games have no movement at all, and some games are all about movement, and in these games it's important that it feels good to move. Fluid movement is very underappreciated in games. If it's fun just getting from point A to point B, you've got a pretty solid game on your hands. In 1981's Donkey Kong, the player controls Jumpman. Despite having that name, his jump is incredibly clunky. Once he's jumping, you have no control over where he lands. Additionally, his movement is dichotic. If you're moving, you'll be going at a fixed speed. This contrasts largely from 1985's Super Mario Bros., in which Mario's movement is much smoother. You have control over every jump's height and direction. You can also run at different speeds and build momentum for jumps that go farther and higher. These two games, despite requiring the player to make the same basic types of inputs, feel drastically different to play, all because of the way they handle movement. One of the strongest testaments to good movement is Yacht Club's Shovel Knight. In the base game, you can only play as Shovel Knight, but in DLC, you gain access to Plague Knight and Spectre Knight. Usually when a game has a variety of characters, they simply have different abilities, but in Shovel Knight, entire playstyles are shifted, and in some cases, the game even feels like a different genre. You have Shovel Knight himself who can jaunt and pogo around, Plague Knight who hops poetically with magic spells, and Spectre Knight who zigzags around gracefully and occasionally does some wicked skateboarding. Even though these characters have largely varying control schemes, they all play on what are essentially the same levels. This doesn't stop them from feeling like entirely different games, which really goes to show how much movement can influence the game you're playing. In general, moving at high speeds invokes a feeling of excitement. This explains how driving games like Burnout manage to keep your pulse pounding. Even though you're usually just holding down a single button to accelerate, your car amps up over time, and there's a satisfying progression in how the velocity increases, culminating in a wave of adrenaline when you reach the max speeds. At the same time, however, some movement manages to be fun despite sluggishness. Sumo Digital's Snake Pass looks like a relaxing time moving through a jungle, but the entire game requires extremely deliberate movement. Instead of zipping through environments, you're taking careful consideration into how you go about maneuvering your snake body across gaps and bamboo shoots. Although not as fast, there's still a visceral pleasure from threading the needle to tighten your grip on sticks and getting where you need to go. Some of my favorite games require the player to continue making inputs while doing something as simple as just moving. In Ocarina of Time, Link runs at one consistent speed, so the player may find themselves constantly rolling just so their fingers have something to do to pass the time. Contrast this with Super Mario 64. While you can just run simply, there are ways to expedite the transportation process. By shifting between the crouch and jump buttons, the player can loop Mario into several long jumps that move him much faster. Pressing these buttons in tandem will deliver the player to their destination sooner while also being fun to input. We also see this in Snake Pass, where going in a straight line is a literal drag. Emulating a real snake by slithering from left to right will move you much faster and occupies your fingers more. Games can risk going too far with this philosophy, however, which is where games like QWOP come up. The player controls two limbs, each of which are controlled by two different buttons. Making any progress in this game requires lots of practice and skill because the controls are all around really clunky. But as counterintuitive as it may sound, clunky movement can serve to benefit a game's overall design. For example, Castlevania has a very tight control scheme reminiscent of how Jumpman moves in Donkey Kong. Jumps always make the same arc and you can't build any momentum. However, Castlevania is all about pacing yourself and learning to function with this challenging control scheme. It might feel heavy and awkward at first, but once you get the hang of it, you'll feel very in control of how Simon Belmont moves. We also see this kind of movement in Gun Media's Friday the 13th the game. One of the most popular methods of winning the game involves repairing and driving a car to safety. However, once fixed, the car has some pretty janky controls. It can build momentum, but there's a bit of a delay to how much the car turns when you move left and right. While this can be frustrating, it builds on the horror themes of the game. If you were being chased by a killer who had the power to stop your car in its tracks, you'd probably be more than a little wobbly behind the wheel. It also does a good job at balancing the game. If the car controlled nicely, it'd be too easy to avoid Jason and make it to safety. These types of movement work because the challenging controls complement the themes presented in the game. But can a game work if its style of movement is directly adverse to its goals? In top-down RTS games like Warcraft, the player can make actions very quickly and easily by clicking in various locations on the screen. This works because moving the mouse is very fast, easy, and conducive to RTS play. That said, not all RTSs do this. Double Fine's Brutal Legend is a strange hybrid of action-adventure and RTS. But what's notable about it is that even during those RTS segments, the game functions in third person. You control a single entity that needs to run around the map in order to spawn and control units. It might be unconventional to think of it like this, but in a way, your character is the mouse of this game. It's just that his movement isn't nearly as simple as the mouse you have in most RTSs. The need to literally traverse an environment is inauspicious to the playstyle of an RTS, so these segments of the game feel very bizarre. However, it is possible to get used to it, and it leads to some very interesting play. So what's the point? Many games are all about movement. While it can be fun to go at high speeds, moving slowly can also be fun as long as it's smooth and calculative. Adding movement from one genre of games to another can lead to interesting outcomes. Any kind of control can be mismatched with its gameplay, but as long as it's balanced well, almost any variety of movement can be entertaining. While innovating too much on movement in games can be a big risk, it also has strong potential to create grand, unique experiences that we otherwise never would have seen. And that's what's with movement. Thanks so much for watching. If you liked the video, consider subscribing and even giving the video a like. You can also support my Patreon if you want to get some exclusive What's With Games goodies. And don't forget to follow me on Facebook and Twitter.